I stood on the stone steps of the church, holding a wedding gift of $10,000. My own son blocked the heavy oak doors. He looked me right in the eye and told me I was not on the guest list. He said there had been a mistake and asked me to leave before he was forced to call security. 200 guests were watching. I did not cry. I simply nodded, turned around, and got into a waiting taxi. Before the car even left the church parking lot, my phone vibrated. It was a message from my teenage grandson, who was still inside the church. He sent a photograph of a document he had found hidden on my son's desk. That was the exact moment I realized my son had not just stolen my family. He had just stolen my $2.5 million home. I did not know it yet, but the humiliation on those church steps had just given me the time I needed to uncover everything. The October air in the Chicago suburbs carried a sharp chill. I pulled my silk shawl tighter around my shoulders as I walked up the pathway to St. Jude Episcopal Church. I was 68 years old, and today was supposed to be a day of joy. My granddaughter Madison was getting married. I had spent weeks picking out the perfect dress, a conservative navy blue that would not draw attention away from the bride. In my purse was a cashier's check for $10,000, meant to help the young couple start their new life. I reached the top of the stone steps. The heavy wooden doors were propped open. Classical music drifted out from the sanctuary. Guests were mingling in the foyer, signing the guest book. I took a deep breath, ready to celebrate. But before I could step inside, a hand pressed flat against the center of my chest. Not a gentle touch, a firm physical barrier. I looked up. It was Bradley, my 45-year-old son. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the successful regional manager he always pretended to be. But his jaw was tight, and his eyes held a cold, hard glint. "Mom," he said, keeping his hand pressed against my silk shawl, "you need to leave." I stared at him, trying to process the words. "Bradley, what are you talking about? The ceremony is about to start." "You are not on the list," he said, his voice loud enough for the guests near the door to hear. "There was a mistake with the invitations. We do not have a seat for you. You need to turn around and go home right now." The murmurs in the foyer stopped. People turned to look. I saw friends of our family, people I had known for decades, staring at us with wide eyes. I looked past Bradley and saw his wife, Cynthia. She was standing near the guest book, wearing an emerald green dress that cost more than her first car. Cynthia did not look embarrassed. She looked triumphant. She caught my eye and offered a small, icy smile. Most mothers would have broken down. Most grandmothers would have cried, pleaded, or caused a scene. But I did not. For 35 years, I worked as a forensic-certified public accountant. My entire career was built on walking into hostile boardrooms, sitting across from desperate executives who had embezzled millions and watching them lie to my face. I made my living reading body language, finding the hidden truth, and never ever letting my emotions cloud the facts. I looked at my son. I saw the slight tremor in his fingers. I noticed the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cold October air. I was not just angry, he was terrified. He was trying to push me away because he was hiding something massive, and my presence threatened it. "It is fine, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "I will not cause a scene at Madison's wedding. Enjoy the day." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on my son, walked down the stone steps with my head held high, and signaled for a taxi waiting at the curb. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver my home address. I felt nothing but a cold, sharp focus settling over my mind. The taxi pulled away from the curb. I watched the church shrink in the rearview mirror. I opened my purse to put the wedding gift away. Before I could tuck the envelope into the zippered pocket, my cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from Caleb. Caleb was Bradley and Cynthia's 19-year-old son, my grandson. He was a brilliant college student studying computer science, and he was the only person in that house who had never treated me like a burden. I opened the message. The text was short and frantic. "Grandma, I am hiding in the choir room. Dad locked his home office yesterday, but he forgot I know how to bypass the electronic lock. I went in to look for my phone charger. I found a folder on his desk. They did it. They closed the loan. I am sending you a picture right now. Do not call me back. Mom is looking for me." A second later, an image loaded on my screen. I tapped the photo to zoom in. The glow of the phone illuminated the dark back seat of the taxi. It was a single page of a multi-page banking document, an approval letter from a major national bank. The heading read, "Home Equity Line of Credit Approval." My forensic accounting brain immediately scanned the numbers and the names. The approved credit line was for $1.2 million. The collateral listed was my address, my $2.5 million estate in the northern suburbs. A house I had owned free and clear since my husband passed away 15 years ago. I stared at the glowing screen. The borrower names listed on the approval letter were Bradley and Cynthia. This was legally impossible. You cannot take out a home equity line of credit on a property you do not own. The bank would never approve a $1 million loan against an asset without the titled owner signing the mortgage documents. To execute this kind of transaction, the bank would require a durable power of attorney, a highly specific legal document granting someone the absolute right to pledge my real estate as collateral. I had never signed a durable power of attorney. I had deliberately kept complete control over my finances precisely because I knew Bradley was reckless with money. I zoomed in closer on the photograph. The bottom of the page showed a stamp from the county recorder's office. The loan had been officially filed and recorded late Friday afternoon, just yesterday. They had pushed the paperwork through at the very end of the business week, ensuring no alerts would trigger until Monday morning. Today was Saturday. They were using their daughter's wedding as a distraction while they finalized the theft of my entire net worth. The taxi pulled into my long, winding driveway. I tipped the driver with cash and walked to my front door. The house was completely silent. It was a beautiful home filled with antique furniture, original artwork, and memories of my late husband. But right now, it did not feel like a home. It felt like a crime scene. I did not bother taking off my coat. I walked straight down the hallway and into my home office. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, woke up my computer monitors, and went to work. This was my domain. Bradley and Cynthia thought I was just a retired old woman who baked cookies and knitted sweaters. They completely forgot that I spent 35 years tracking down offshore accounts, uncovering corporate tax fraud, and testifying as an expert witness in federal court. I opened my web browser and navigated straight to the county clerk's public records portal. I paid the access fee and typed in my property index number. The search results populated instantly. There were 2 new documents recorded against my property just 24 hours ago. The first document was the durable power of attorney. I paid $2 to download the digital copy. When the file opened on my screen, I felt my blood turn to ice water. It was a beautifully forged legal instrument. It granted Bradley complete unrestricted control over my real estate, my bank accounts, and my medical decisions. I scrolled down to the signature line. There was my name perfectly faked, imitating the exact loop of my cursive letters. But a forged signature is not enough to fool a major bank. The document had to be notarized. A licensed notary public had to swear under penalty of perjury that they had verified my identity and witnessed me sign the paper in person. I looked at the notary stamp placed right next to my forged signature. The seal belonged to a man named Todd Miller. Todd Miller was Cynthia's younger brother. I sat back in my leather chair. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. This was not a desperate son making a mistake. This was an organized, premeditated criminal syndicate operating inside my own family. Cynthia had provided the notary seal through her brother. Bradley had executed the loan. They had orchestrated this entire scheme together. I opened the second document from the county records. It was the deed of trust for the $1.2 million loan. The money had been disbursed yesterday. $1.2 million had been pulled directly out of the equity of my home and deposited somewhere else. If I did not act, I would lose the house. The bank would demand their monthly payments. When I refused to pay a loan I never took out, they would foreclose on the property. Bradley and Cynthia would walk away with over $1 million in cash and I would be thrown out into the street. I did not chase the money yet. The fastest way to ruin a fraud investigation is to run after every moving dollar before you have preserved the instrument that made the theft possible. I needed to freeze the facts first. I created a new case folder on an encrypted external drive and saved the county record exactly as it appeared online, including the filing number recorder, timestamp page count, and digital certification. Then I printed a paper copy and wrote the download time across the top in ink. 35 years of forensic work had taught me that criminals attack evidence in the same order. They attack people first, they deny it exists, then they claim it was altered, then they insist the victim misunderstood it. I intended to leave them no room for any of those arguments. I enlarged the signature page until my forged name filled the center monitor. Whoever created it had studied me carefully. The capital H curved the way mine did. The final stroke of my surname lifted at almost the same angle. But imitation is not identity. My genuine signature has a tiny hesitation before the last letter, a habit left from an old injury in my right hand. The forgery moved through that spot too smoothly. I opened archived tax filings, a property insurance renewal, and the original warranty documents for the house. I placed authentic samples beside the forged power of attorney and marked the differences one by one. The false signature was designed to fool a loan processor glancing at a screen. It was not designed to survive a forensic comparison. Then I studied the notarial block. The document claimed I had appeared before Todd in person late Thursday afternoon. That single line was almost more valuable than the fake signature. On Thursday afternoon, I had not been anywhere near Todd. I had been in Springfield for a continuing education seminar connected to a state tax conference. My hotel receipt, parking record, electronic toll history, and seminar sign-in record would all place me more than 100 miles away at the exact hour Todd swore he had watched me sign. I opened my email, located the hotel confirmation, and saved it to the same evidence folder. I did the same with the seminar registration. I was not building an emotional complaint against my family. I was building an alibi against a notarized lie. The metadata on the filing told an equally ugly story. The power of attorney had been recorded only minutes before the deed of trust tied to the home equity line. The sequence was too neat to be accidental. First, someone manufactured authority over my property. Then almost immediately that authority was used to pledge the house for $1.2 million. I wrote the two recording numbers on a legal pad and drew a line between them. Bradley and Cynthia had not stumbled into a bad decision. They had prepared a mechanism, timed the filing, and used Madison's wedding weekend as cover. I checked the county index again for older filings under my name. Nothing else had changed. The title still showed me as owner. There was no legitimate transfer, no prior authorization, no document that could plausibly explain what I was seeing. That mattered. If Bradley later claimed I had verbally agreed to let him borrow against the house, the public record would still show that the only written authority supporting the transaction was the instrument bearing Todd's false certification. For several minutes, I sat absolutely still and listened to the hum of the monitors. The pain of being barred from Madison's wedding had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. At the church, I had thought Bradley wanted to humiliate me. Now I understood that the humiliation was camouflage. If I had been inside the reception asking questions, speaking with Caleb, or simply remaining visible to relatives who knew my habits, I might have complicated the story Bradley and Cynthia were preparing to tell. Removing me from the wedding was not just cruelty, it was operational security. That realization hardened something inside me. I opened the contact page for the bank named on the approval letter, but I did not submit a general customer service complaint. Not yet. A careless phone call could alert Bradley before I knew the full structure of the transaction. Instead, I saved the fraud department information, noted the weekend emergency number, and closed the page. I would use it when I had a complete packet and legal guidance. Until then, secrecy was an advantage they still believed belonged to them. I looked again at Todd's seal. Cynthia's younger brother had placed his professional license directly beside my forged name. That was the first human weakness in their plan. Signatures can be disputed, intent can be argued, but a notary who certifies that a woman was physically present when objective records place her in another city has created a contradiction that does not depend on anyone's feelings. I printed the page a second time and circled Todd's commission information in red. Only then did I turn away from the monitors. The digital copies were useful, but I wanted the original deed in my hands. I crossed the office, moved my heavy leather chair aside, and rolled back the edge of the antique Persian rug. Beneath it, flush with the hardwood floor, was the steel safe that held the documents Bradley and Cynthia had apparently forgotten still existed. I knelt down and spun the combination dial. The mechanism clicked with a heavy, satisfying sound. I pulled the heavy steel door open and reached inside. I bypassed the jewelry boxes and the emergency cache. I pulled out a thick, fireproof envelope. Inside were the original closing documents from when my late husband and I purchased this house over 30 years ago. I pulled out the original deed printed on heavy stock paper. It bore the raised seal of the county clerk and my authentic signature. I carried the original deed back to my desk and laid it flat next to my keyboard. I looked at my authentic signature, and then I looked at the digital forgery on my monitor. The forgery was good. Cynthia must have spent hours tracing my handwriting to get the loops just right. But a good forgery is only the first step in a financial crime. The real test is how well you hide the money once you steal it. I closed the public records portal and opened a very different program. It was a proprietary forensic tracing software suite. I had written the original architecture for this program 20 years ago to help federal agents track cartel money laundering operations. I still held the patent, and I still maintained backdoor access to banking routing protocols that ordinary citizens could never reach. I typed the routing number from Bradley's holding account into the software. I commanded the system to execute a deep trace on all outgoing wire transfers from the past 48 hours. A loading bar appeared on the screen. The room was perfectly silent, except for the low hum of my computer tower. My son and his wife had stolen $1.2 million. They executed the home equity loan on a Friday afternoon. In the banking world, a Friday afternoon wire transfer is the oldest trick in the book. You push the money through right before the weekend, because bank compliance officers go home at 5 o'clock. The automated fraud detection algorithms run their batch reports overnight, but human auditors do not review those flagged transactions until Monday morning. Bradley and Cynthia thought they had bought themselves 48 hours of invisible time to scatter the funds. The software chimed softly. The trace was complete. The $1.2 million had remained in Bradley's temporary holding account for less than 10 minutes. From there, the money had been broken into 3 separate transfers. That mattered because the division was not random. Each portion appeared designed to solve a different emergency in Bradley and Cynthia's collapsing financial life. I opened the first transfer. $400,000 had been routed to a commercial bank in Delaware for the benefit of Apex Commercial Liquidations. I recognized the type of company immediately. Apex operated in the dangerous end of distressed commercial debt-buying obligations that ordinary banks wanted nowhere near. Bradley was not simply carrying too much credit card debt. He had borrowed from people and entities that expected repayment quickly and did not care about his excuses. The $400,000 was a survival payment. He had put my house at risk to buy himself breathing room. The second transfer was larger. $600,000 had been sent to the operating trust account of Sterling Prestige Realty, the luxury brokerage where Cynthia worked as a senior managing broker. I leaned closer to the screen. Money is supposed to flow out of a brokerage operating structure for legitimate expenses or remain segregated for clients. A sudden $600,000 injection from a private family loan made no ordinary business sense. It looked like a hole being filled. I cross-referenced the receiving account against the public corporate registry and the account descriptions captured in Bradley's records. The pattern pointed in one direction: escrow. If Cynthia had taken client deposits and used them elsewhere, she would need to restore the missing balance before an audit compared the ledger to the actual bank account. $600,000 was not a lifestyle purchase. It was a desperate attempt to make stolen client money reappear before someone official opened the books. The third transfer was the remaining $200,000. Unlike the first two, it had not left Bradley's control. It had been parked in a dormant reserve account. He already owned a place with almost no recent activity. I could see the balance, but the transaction memo was deliberately vague. There was no vendor, no debt reference, no business purpose. Just $200,000 sitting behind a newly activated online credential. I flagged the account and saved the routing information. Whatever Bradley intended to do with that last portion, he had not done it yet. Before I could dig deeper into the reserve account, a pair of headlights swept across my office wall. I glanced at the security camera feed on my secondary monitor. A beat-up silver sedan was pulling into my driveway. I checked the time. It was 11 o'clock at night. The wedding reception downtown should still be in full swing. I watched the camera feed as the driver's side door opened. A tall, thin young man stepped out into the cold night air. He was wearing a dark formal suit, but his tie was pulled loose and his jacket was unbuttoned. It was my grandson Caleb. I walked quickly to the front door and opened it before he could even ring the bell. Caleb stood on the porch shivering. He looked completely exhausted. His eyes were red and his face was pale with stress. He did not say a word. He just stepped inside and wrapped his arms around me in a tight, desperate hug. I held him close, feeling the tension vibrating in his shoulders. "I am so sorry, Grandma," he whispered. "I tried to warn you sooner. I only found the paperwork today." "You did exactly the right thing, Caleb," I told him softly. "You warned me. That is all that matters. Come into the office." Caleb followed me down the hallway. When we stepped into the office, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black object. It was a portable solid-state hard drive. He set it on my desk next to my keyboard. "I cloned it," Caleb said. His voice was trembling slightly, but his eyes were focused. Dad left his work laptop in his hotel suite while he went down to the ballroom for the wedding reception. He had a few drinks at dinner and forgot to lock the hotel room safe. I slipped upstairs, plugged this drive in, and ran a mirror script. I copied his entire hard drive. Every email, every hidden folder, every downloaded document. I looked at my 19-year-old grandson. He was a brilliant computer science student, but right now he just looked like a heartbroken child. "What made you suspect them, Caleb?" I asked gently. "Why did you start looking through his office in the first place?" Caleb looked down at his shoes. His jaw tightened. "Because of what they did to me last month." I motioned for him to sit in the armchair across from my desk. "What did they do to you?" Caleb took a deep breath. "You know that college fund you started for me when I was a baby? The one you handed over to Dad to manage when I turned 10? Last month, right after my 19th birthday, Dad and Mom sat me down at the kitchen table. They told me the family business was going through a temporary cash flow crisis. They said they needed to borrow the money from my college fund just for a few weeks to keep the house. They put a stack of papers in front of me and told me to sign over my beneficiary rights. A cold wave of disgust washed over me. "How much was in the fund, Caleb?" $85,000, he said softly. I signed the papers because they promised they would put it back before my next tuition bill was due. But the tuition bill arrived yesterday. I asked Dad for the money. He screamed at me. He told me I was an ungrateful brat and that the money was gone. He said it was his money anyway because he was the one raising me. When he yelled at me, I realized he was never going to put it back. That is why I started digging through his desk. I wanted to see where my college money went. Instead, I found the loan documents for your house. My heart broke for him. His own parents had manipulated and robbed him. They stripped away his educational future without a second thought. It confirmed exactly what I was dealing with. Bradley and Cynthia had no boundaries, no morals, and no loyalty. They would sacrifice anyone to save themselves. "We are going to get your money back, Caleb," I said firmly. "I promise you that. But first we need to see exactly what is on this hard drive." Caleb nodded. He pulled his chair closer to my desk and connected the black hard drive to my computer. A prompt popped up on the screen asking for a decryption password. "Dad uses commercial-grade encryption for his work files," Caleb explained. "But he is lazy. He uses the same core password algorithm for everything. Give me 2 minutes." Caleb's fingers flew across my keyboard. He opened a command terminal and typed out a rapid sequence of code. He was bypassing the front-end security and attacking the encryption key directly. Less than 60 seconds later, the prompt vanished. A massive directory of folders populated the screen. Caleb navigated past the standard work folders and family photos. He scrolled all the way to the bottom and found a hidden directory labeled Legal Archive. He clicked it open. The folder was full of scanned PDF documents, email backups, and bank statements. I took control of the mouse and started opening the files one by one. The first few documents were exactly what I expected. Demands for payment from high-interest commercial lenders, threatening emails from collection attorneys. Bradley's financial life was a complete disaster. But the final document in the folder was different. It was a scanned piece of official government mail. The letterhead bore the official seal of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. It was addressed directly to Cynthia at her real estate brokerage firm. I opened the document and read the text. It was a formal notice of a mandatory state audit. State regulators had detected severe irregularities in Cynthia's escrow accounts. The letter informed her that a team of state auditors would be arriving at her office to conduct a full forensic review of her ledger. I checked the date of the scheduled audit. It was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. I pointed at the screen. "Look at this, Caleb. This is why they used Madison's wedding weekend as cover. This is why they forged my signature yesterday and rushed the loan through before anyone could question the paperwork." Caleb read the letter. His eyes widened as the reality set in. Mom is missing $600,000 from her client accounts. If the state auditors show up on Tuesday and the money is gone, she goes to federal prison. "Exactly," I said. "They needed cash immediately. They drained your college fund first, but $85,000 was not nearly enough to cover a $600,000 hole. They needed a massive injection of capital before Tuesday morning. So they decided to sacrifice my house. They pulled the $1.2 million paid off Bradley's dangerous creditors and wired the rest to Cynthia's brokerage to balance her escrow ledger before the state auditors walked through her door. Caleb sank back into his chair, staring at the screen in horror. "They are going to jail," he whispered. I looked at the forged signatures, the wire transfer receipts, and the state audit notice. The evidence was absolute. It was irrefutable. My son and his wife had built a house of cards out of greed and lies, and it was finally collapsing. "Yes, Caleb," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as cracked glass. "They are going to jail, but first I am going to make sure they lose absolutely everything they value in this world." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. The sound echoed through the empty house. I did not feel tired. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. Richard picked up on the 3rd ring. He did not sound asleep. Richard was the kind of man who always seemed to be awake, waiting for a fight. He was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless financial litigation firms in Chicago. More importantly, he was my late husband's closest friend. "Helen," he said. His voice was gravelly and sharp. "I need you at my house right now," I told him. "Bradley just took out a fraudulent $1.2 million mortgage on my property and forged my signature on a power of attorney." There was a beat of absolute silence on the line. Then I heard the sound of keys jingling. "I am leaving my driveway now," Richard said. "Do not touch anything on the computer until I get there." 20 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed from my front door. I let Richard in. He wore a dark wool overcoat over a simple sweater, his silver hair neatly combed despite the hour. He walked straight into my office, took off his coat, and looked at Caleb sitting in the corner. "Caleb," Richard nodded. "Good to see you, son, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Richard pulled up a chair next to my desk. I walked him through the digital blood trail we had uncovered. I showed him the forged county records, the wire transfers to the shadow debt liquidator, and the massive deposit into Cynthia's real estate brokerage account. Richard leaned close to the monitor. His eyes tracked the routing numbers with the speed of a predator locking onto a scent. He cross-referenced the wire timestamps with the county clerk stamps. "They pushed the loan approval through on Friday afternoon." Richard muttered, his voice tight with anger. "It is a classic Friday execution. They know bank compliance departments operate on skeleton crews over the weekend. The automated clearinghouse system will hold these wires in a pending state until Monday morning. If we wait until Monday to file a fraud report, I said the money will clear." "Worse than that," Richard corrected. "The debt liquidator will immediately transfer their cut to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands or Belize. Once it crosses international borders, we will spend 5 years and $500,000 in legal fees trying to claw it back. And Cynthia will use Monday morning to officially reconcile her escrow ledger. If her stolen funds are balanced before the state audit on Tuesday, she might escape federal prison." "We cannot wait until Monday," I stated. The room felt suddenly very cold. The reality of the timeline was pressing down on us. Richard stood up and began pacing the length of my office. "We need an ex parte emergency injunction. We need a federal asset freeze. But getting a judge to sign an emergency order on a Sunday morning is nearly impossible unless life or limb is in immediate danger." I looked at the digital clock on my monitor. It was 2:30 in the morning. "Where is Bradley right now?" Richard asked. "I is staying at the Palmer House Hotel downtown." Caleb answered quietly from his chair. "The wedding reception ended an hour ago. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Dad is hosting a massive post-wedding brunch at the Oak Brook Country Club. He invited all the out-of-town guests, his corporate bosses, and the entire wedding party. He rented the grand ballroom. He bragged all week about how he was paying for the whole thing himself to show everyone how successful he is." Richard stopped pacing. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "I is hosting a brunch at the country club," Richard repeated. "He is going to hand the manager a credit card to pay a massive catering bill in front of his boss and his new in-laws." "Yes," Caleb said. Richard looked at me. His eyes were shining with a brilliant dark intensity. "Helen, if we can get a judge to sign a federal freeze order by 9 o'clock this morning, we can transmit the order directly to the banking network. We can freeze every single account attached to Bradley's Social Security number. Personal accounts, business accounts, credit cards, everything." "We hit them at the country club," I said softly. "We drop the hammer right when he tries to pay the bill." Richard agreed. "We strike his social vulnerability. Men like Bradley care about their public image more than they care about their own families. We are going to strip that image away in front of everyone he is trying to impress. To do that, I noted, we have exactly 5.5 hours to build a bulletproof legal case from scratch." "Then we better make more coffee," Richard said. He pulled a yellow legal pad from his briefcase and slammed it onto my desk. Let us go to work. The office transformed into a war room. The three of us settled into a rhythm born of pure necessity. I handled the financial documentation. I exported every routing number, every forged signature, and every ledger discrepancy into a secure encrypted file. I mapped out the exact flow of the stolen $1.2 million, creating visual charts that any judge could understand in seconds. Richard drafted the emergency injunction motions. His fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, typing out dense legal arguments, citing federal wire fraud statutes and elder abuse protections. He was building an ironclad cage of legal precedent around my son and daughter-in-law. Caleb sat in the corner, his computer screen filled with lines of scrolling code. I need a task for the notary, Caleb said without looking up from his screen. Uncle Todd stamped the fake power of attorney. He is the weak link in their chain. I turned my chair toward my grandson. What are you thinking, Caleb? Todd works as a licensed notary public for the state of Illinois, Caleb explained. The state maintains an automated digital complaint portal for reporting notary fraud. If a complaint is filed with substantial digital proof, the system automatically suspends the notary seal pending a state police investigation. Do it, Richard said from across the room. Draft the complaint, attach the real estate documents and the proof of Helen's actual location during the time of the forged signature. I was in Springfield at a tax seminar on the day the document was supposedly signed, I told Caleb. I can pull my hotel receipts and my continuing education sign-in sheets right now. Send them to me, Caleb said. I am writing a custom script. I will set the script to compile the evidence and submit the formal fraud report to the state portal exactly at 9:30 this morning. Todd will receive an automated email stripping him of his license before he even finishes his morning coffee. He will panic, and when criminals panic, they turn on each other. We worked straight through the night. The sky outside my office window slowly turned from pitch black to a deep, bruised purple. The streetlights flickered off. Sunday morning was breaking over Chicago. At 7:30 in the morning, Richard hit print. My heavy laser printer roared to life, spitting out 40 pages of emergency legal motions, financial tracing reports, and sworn affidavits. We stacked the papers into a neat, terrifying pile on my desk. Now comes the hard part, Richard said, rubbing his tired eyes. We need a judge to read this and sign it before the banks open their automated portals at 9. Who is the duty judge for the federal district this weekend, I asked. Richard checked his phone. He let out a long breath. It is Judge Harrison. I froze. Marcus Harrison was a federal judge now, but 25 years ago, he was a young, struggling attorney trying to start his own practice. My late husband had loaned him the startup capital when no bank would touch him. My husband never asked for interest, and he never called in the favor. He just believed in Marcus. The old history could not legally buy us a ruling, and I would never ask for one. What it meant was that Marcus knew my professional reputation and would not ignore an emergency call merely because it came on a Sunday. Call him, I said. Richard dialed the number. He put the phone on speaker and set it on the desk. It rang 5 times. I thought it would go to voicemail. Then a rough, sleep-heavy voice answered. This is Harrison. Marcus, Richard said. It is Richard Cole. I apologize for waking you on a Sunday morning. Richard the judge said, his voice clearing slightly. You know better than to call this line unless the building is on fire. The building is burning, Marcus. I am sitting here with Helen. There was a noticeable pause on the line. The judge's tone completely changed. It softened, shifting from annoyed magistrate to an old loyal friend. Helen, is she all right? Is she hurt? She is physically fine, Richard answered. But her son Bradley and his wife just executed a massive real estate fraud. They forged a power of attorney, took out a $1.2 million loan against her primary residence, and drained her grandson's college fund. The money was wired out late Friday. If we do not freeze the destination accounts right now, the funds will disappear offshore by tomorrow morning. Send me the files, Judge Harrison said instantly. Send them to my secure encrypted email. I will boot up my home terminal right now. Give me 10 minutes to review the evidence. Richard attached the entire packet we had built overnight and hit send. We sat in silence watching the digital clock on my computer monitor click forward. 8:15, 8:20. The tension in the room was suffocating. I thought about Madison waking up on her first morning as a married woman, entirely unaware that her parents were about to be destroyed. I thought about the church doors and Bradley's hand pressing against my chest. At 8:28 the phone rang. Richard answered it on speaker. I have reviewed the files, Judge Harrison said. His voice was completely devoid of warmth now. It was the voice of a federal judge looking at a devastating crime. "The financial tracing is impeccable, Helen. You always did flawless work. The forged signature and the fraudulent notary stamp provide sufficient probable cause for immediate intervention." "Will you sign the freeze order?" Richard asked. "I am digitally signing the ex parte emergency injunction right now," the judge confirmed. "It authorizes the immediate freezing of all assets, accounts, and lines of credit associated with the Social Security numbers of Bradley and Cynthia. It also freezes the destination accounts for the stolen funds. The electronic transmission to the federal banking network will hit the servers in exactly 1 hour." "That is 9:30, Caleb whispered from his corner. "The freeze will be absolute," Judge Harrison continued. "They will not be able to buy a cup of coffee. The order will remain in effect pending a full criminal investigation by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Helen, I am so sorry your son chose this path, but he will not get away with it." "Thank you, Marcus," I said softly. The line disconnected. I looked at Richard, and then I looked at Caleb. The bags under my grandson's eyes were dark, but he sat up straight, his hands resting on his laptop keyboard. "It is done," Richard said. He closed his briefcase. "The banks will lock their accounts at 9:30. What time does the country club brunch begin?" "Guests arrive at 10, Caleb said. "The catering manager usually runs the final payment authorization around 10:30, right before they open the buffet stations." I walked over to the coat rack and grabbed my purse. The sun was fully up now, casting bright morning light across my hardwood floors. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The betrayal had hurt, but the retaliation was going to be surgical. "Are we going to the country club?" Caleb asked. "No," I replied. "I am not going anywhere near that place. When the credit cards decline and the panic sets in, I want Bradley to look around the room and realize I am not there to save him. I want him to feel exactly how isolated and powerless he truly is." I pulled out my prepaid flip phone and set it on the desk. "Now," I said, "we sit down, we drink our coffee, and we wait for my son to realize his life is over." The morning sun poured through the vaulted glass ceilings of the most exclusive country club in the Chicago suburbs. Crystal chandeliers caught the light, casting fractured rainbows across tables draped in heavy white linen. Waiters in pristine uniforms glided across the room, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar, prime rib, and endless flutes of vintage champagne. It was 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. The post-wedding brunch was in full swing, and my son Bradley was standing at the head table basking in what he believed was his ultimate victory. Caleb stood quietly near the back of the banquet room, holding a glass of sparkling water. He was watching the entire scene unfold, and he would later describe every agonizing detail to me. Bradley tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound commanded the attention of the 75 guests in the room. These were not just family members. Bradley had invited his corporate executives, wealthy neighbors, and high-profile real estate developers Cynthia wanted to impress. They all quieted down and turned their attention to the man of the hour. Bradley offered a polished, practiced smile. He raised his glass toward his daughter Madison and her new husband. "To family," Bradley announced, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. "Family is the foundation of everything we build. It is the legacy we leave behind. Cynthia and I wanted to host this brunch today to show all of you how deeply we value that legacy. We spare no expense for the people we love. Cheers to the happy couple, and cheers to a future built on solid ground." The guests applauded politely. Cynthia beamed, resting her hand on Bradley's arm. Her diamond rings caught the morning light. They looked like the perfect, successful American couple. They were entirely convinced that my house had been successfully stolen, their debts were wiped clean, and their crimes were safely buried. As the applause died down and the string quartet resumed playing softly in the corner, the catering manager approached the head table. I was a distinguished older man in a tailored suit carrying a sleek black leather folio. He offered a respectful bow and presented the folio to Bradley. It was the final bill for the lavish morning, $25,000. Bradley did not even glance at the itemized receipt. He wanted everyone at the surrounding tables to see how effortlessly he handled such an exorbitant expense. He pulled a heavy metal credit card from his wallet and dropped it casually onto the silver tray. "Take care of it," Bradley said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "and add a generous tip for the staff." The manager smiled professionally, took the card, and walked away toward the service corridor. Bradley turned back to his guests, laughing at a joke told by one of his wealthy neighbors. For exactly 4 minutes he remained the king of his fragile empire. Then the manager returned. His professional smile was gone, replaced by a tight, uncomfortable expression. He leaned down and whispered discreetly into Bradley's ear. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the manager said. "Your card was declined." Bradley waved it off completely unbothered. He assumed it was a standard security measure. "Fraud protection," Bradley said loudly, making sure his boss at the next table could hear. "You know how these credit card companies get when you drop $25,000 before noon? They flag everything." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a different platinum card. He handed it to the manager with a confident smirk. "Try this one. It has no limit." The manager took the second card and walked away. The conversation around the head table resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted ever so slightly. A few minutes later, the manager walked back into the dining room. His pace was faster this time. He looked genuinely distressed. "Sir," the manager whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "this card has also been declined." Bradley's confident smirk vanished. A dark flush of anger crept up his neck. "What are you talking about? Run it again. Your machine must be broken." Cynthia noticed the commotion and turned her attention away from a real estate developer. She let out an annoyed sigh, opened her designer clutch, and pulled out her corporate brokerage card. "Just use mine, Bradley," she snapped. "Stop arguing with the staff. We have guests waiting to eat." She shoved her corporate card into the manager's hand. The manager hurried away for a third time. By now, the people sitting at the tables closest to the bridal party had stopped talking. The clinking of silverware slowed down. The whispered rumors began to ripple through the room. "Wealthy people have a sixth sense for financial trouble, and they could smell it on my son." When the manager returned for the final time, he did not whisper. He was sweating, and he looked terrified of the scene he was about to cause. He placed Cynthia's corporate card and Bradley's 2 platinum cards onto the white tablecloth. "I cannot process any of these payments," the manager announced. His voice echoed clearly across the sudden silence of the banquet room. "Sir, the merchant terminal is reporting a specific federal restriction. It is throwing code 04. The bank states that all of your financial accounts have been frozen due to suspected federal financial fraud." The string quartet stopped playing. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the room. "Code 04, suspected federal fraud." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Bradley's corporate boss, sitting just 10 feet away, slowly lowered his coffee cup. The real estate developers Cynthia had been courting exchanged alarmed glances and subtly shifted their chairs backward, physically distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Bradley stood up so fast, his chair tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. "You listen to me," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the manager. "I will buy this entire country club and fire you before lunch. Run the cards again." Before the manager could respond, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. A man in a plain gray suit walked into the room. He did not look like a wedding guest. He moved with the cold, unstoppable momentum of a natural disaster. He carried a thick, heavy manila envelope in his right hand. The man walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the stares of the 75 guests. He walked directly up to the head table where my son was standing drenched in cold sweat. "Bradley," the man asked. His voice was loud, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "Yes," Bradley stammered, stepping back. "Who are you?" The man slapped the thick manila envelope directly against Bradley's chest. Bradley instinctively grabbed it to keep it from falling. "Letter from Helen's attorney," the man said clearly. "You have been served." The process server turned on his heel and walked out of the silent ballroom, leaving my son holding the instrument of his own destruction. Bradley's hands shook violently as he stared at the thick manila envelope. The heavy paper felt like a live explosive in his grip. The entire ballroom was watching him. 200 pairs of eyes were locked onto his pale, sweating face. His corporate superiors, Cynthia's wealthy clients, and his new son-in-law's family all waited in absolute silence. "Open it!" Cynthia hissed, grabbing Bradley's arm. Her manicured nails dug into his tuxedo jacket. "Tell them it is just a misunderstanding. Tell them it is a mistake." Bradley tore the top of the envelope. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents. He expected to see a standard civil lawsuit, maybe a cease and desist letter drafted by a local attorney. Instead, he pulled out a document bearing the terrifying, majestic seal of a United States federal district court. It was an ex parte emergency injunction. Bradley's eyes darted across the bold, capitalized text at the top of the page. He read the words aloud, his voice barely more than a ragged whisper. "Order for immediate freezing of all assets, routing destinations, and lines of credit." He flipped the page with trembling fingers. The document detailed the exact flow of the $1.2 million they had stolen yesterday afternoon. It listed the precise routing numbers they had used. It named the offshore commercial debt liquidator. The court order explicitly stated that the funds were seized pending a full criminal investigation by federal authorities for wire fraud and elder abuse. Cynthia snatched the next stack of papers from his hands. As she looked at the documents, all the color instantly vanished from her face. She was not looking at court orders. She was looking at a forensic accounting spreadsheet I had printed from my home office at 4 a.m. The spreadsheet detailed every single fraudulent transfer Cynthia had made over the last 8 months. It showed exactly how she had siphoned $600,000 out of her clients' escrow accounts. It showed how she had funneled the money to pay for her luxury vehicles and expensive vacations. But the final page was what completely broke her. The final page paired the state audit notice with the automated notary fraud complaint Caleb had filed against Todd. The timestamps proved that the regulators now had both sides of the scheme: the suspicious escrow shortage at Cynthia's firm and the false notarial act that made the fraudulent loan possible. Her plan to replace the missing escrow money with my home equity had failed. The auditors were still coming, and the trap was closing from 2 directions. Cynthia let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She dropped the forensic spreadsheet onto the white tablecloth like it was burning her skin. As the legal papers scattered across the table, a smaller personal envelope slid out from the pile and landed right in front of Bradley. It was a heavy cream stationery envelope. My name was embossed on the top left corner. Bradley picked it up slowly. He opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He recognized my handwriting immediately. I had written it by hand at my kitchen table while waiting for the sun to rise. I wanted him to feel the personal, intimate nature of his defeat. Bradley stared at the paper. "Read it!" Cynthia demanded, her voice bordering on hysteria. "What does she want? What did she say?" Bradley swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he read my final message out loud to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear from the back of the room. "Thank you for not letting me into the wedding. It gave me enough time to lock all your escape routes." Cynthia backed away from the table. Her perfect posture collapsed. She looked like a trapped animal surrounded by hunters. She realized the money was gone, the bank accounts were locked, and the state auditors already had the evidence of her embezzlement. There was only one person left who could possibly save them from federal prison. "Todd," Cynthia whispered frantically. "We need my brother. He is the notary. He can tell the police that Helen was actually there. He can testify that she signed the power of attorney willingly. If he backs our story, it becomes a civil dispute, not a criminal forgery." She dug into her designer clutch and pulled out her cell phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it twice before finally dialing her brother's number. She hit the speakerphone button, desperate for anyone to hear a voice that could validate her lies. The phone rang loudly in the silent ballroom. Once, twice, 3 times. Cynthia held her breath, praying for her brother to answer. Finally, the line clicked open. But the voice on the other end did not belong to Todd. It was a deep, authoritative voice echoing with the background noise of police radios and shuffling boots. "This is Investigator Miller with the Illinois State Police Financial Crimes Division," the gruff voice announced over the speakerphone. "We are executing a search and evidence preservation warrant. This phone has been seized and Todd Miller is being interviewed. Who is calling?" Cynthia dropped the phone. It hit a crystal champagne flute, shattering the delicate glass into dozens of jagged pieces across the table. She stared at the shattered glass, completely paralyzed. Todd's phone had already been seized, and investigators were inside his home preserving evidence. Caleb's automated complaint had triggered immediate scrutiny of the notarial act. Todd was no longer a safe witness Cynthia could control, and the final pillar of their conspiracy had begun to crack. Bradley slowly looked it up from the table. He looked past his crying wife. He looked past the shattered crystal. He looked out at the 200 wedding guests who were staring at him in absolute horrified silence. His boss was already typing furiously on a cell phone, likely drafting Bradley's termination email. The wealthy neighbors were turning away in disgust. Madison, the bride, stood frozen near the dance floor, her hands covering her mouth as she realized her entire perfect day had been funded by stolen money. They had tried to take my home. They had tried to take my grandson's college fund. They had barred me from the church because they thought I was weak. Now, standing in the ruins of his own public execution, Bradley finally understood the truth. He had not just stolen from an old woman. He had declared war on the wrong mother, and he had just lost absolutely everything. The heavy crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet atmosphere of my Sunday afternoon. I did not need to look out the window to know who had just pulled into my driveway. The violent screech of brake pads and the immediate aggressive slamming of car doors told me everything. Bradley and Cynthia had arrived. I sat comfortably in my living room sipping a cup of chamomile tea. My tablet rested on my lap, displaying a crisp, high-definition feed from the new security cameras I had installed 24 hours earlier. I had not just replaced the old brass locks on my doors. I had hired a premium security firm to upgrade the entire perimeter of my property. My home was now a digital fortress equipped with reinforced smart deadbolts motion tracking sensors and cloud-linked audio recording. On my screen, I watched my son march up the front walkway. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His tuxedo from the country club brunch was wrinkled, the collar of his expensive shirt pulled open and drenched in sweat. Cynthia trailed closely behind him, her emerald green dress looking ridiculous in the middle of a suburban afternoon. She was clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Bradley did not ring the doorbell. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his old set of keys, and shoved the brass key into the front door lock. He twisted his wrist. The key did not turn. I watched his expression shift from anger to absolute confusion. He yanked the key out, checked the grooves, and shoved it back into the cylinder. He shoved his shoulder against the heavy oak door, grunting with effort, but the reinforced smart lock held firm. "Open this door!" Bradley shouted, his voice muffled through the thick, insulated glass. "I know you are in there. Open the door right now." He pounded his fist against the wood. The heavy thuds echoed through the hallway, but I did not move from my chair. I simply watched the live feed. Beside him, Cynthia began frantically tapping on the glass side light, trying to peer through the sheer curtains. "She changed the locks!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. "She actually locked us out." Bradley took a step back from the door. The raw fury in his eyes began to morph into something else. It was the frantic, calculating look of a predator, realizing it had been caught in a trap. He looked up and down the street. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Several of my neighbors were out in their yards. Mr. Henderson was washing his car 2 houses down, and Mrs. Gable was standing on her front porch watering her hanging ferns. Bradley noticed the audience. Instantly, his entire demeanor shifted. The aggressive door-pounding thug vanished. In his place stood a deeply concerned, heartbroken son. It was a terrifyingly smooth transition, a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Mom," Bradley cried out. His voice was suddenly thick with artificial emotion, loud enough to carry across the manicured lawns. "Mom, please open the door. We are so worried about you." Cynthia immediately caught on to the performance. She covered her mouth with her hand and let out a dramatic, trembling sob. "Please, Helen," Cynthia wailed, leaning against the doorframe like a devastated daughter. "You are not well. You are confused. Let us take you to a doctor." I watched them put on their show. This is the weapon of choice for abusers who target the elderly: gaslighting. They create a public narrative that the victim is losing their mind, suffering from dementia, or experiencing paranoid delusions. They scream it loudly so the neighbors hear. They plant the seed of doubt in the community. If they can convince the world that I am a crazy, paranoid old woman, then any accusations I make about stolen money or forged documents can be easily dismissed as the ramblings of a sick mind. "Mom, you are having a severe cognitive episode," Bradley shouted toward the second-story windows. "Your mind is slipping. You need your medication. Please just unlock the door so we can get you to a hospital. Do not make me call the authorities for a wellness check." Mrs. Gable paused her watering across the street, looking over with deep concern. Bradley was playing the devastated caregiver perfectly. He wanted the neighborhood to pity him. He wanted to establish a medical alibi for the financial crimes he had committed. I picked up my tablet. I tapped the microphone icon on the security application. The two-way audio system activated, broadcasting my voice through the hidden exterior speakers mounted on the porch ceiling. My voice cut through the crisp autumn air. It was not shaking. It was not confused. It was the cold, authoritative tone of a senior forensic auditor calling an end to a fraudulent meeting. "Your performance is quite impressive, Bradley," I announced through the speakers, "but you are playing to the wrong audience." Bradley froze. He looked up, trying to locate the source of the sound. Cynthia stopped her fake crying and stumbled backward, her eyes darting frantically around the porch. "These cameras are currently recording in high-definition audio and video." I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the front lawn. The feed is not stored on a local hard drive. It is uploading continuously to a secure cloud server, and I just forwarded the link to the federal authorities reviewing your file. Bradley went entirely pale. The false concern dropped from his face like a lead weight. You committed federal wire fraud yesterday afternoon, I stated smoothly. You forged a legal document. You stole your own son's college fund. You will not cure those felonies by standing on my porch and pretending I have dementia. Step off my property immediately, or I will activate the silent alarm and have you both arrested for criminal trespassing. Cynthia grabbed Bradley's arm. Her face was completely devoid of color. The mention of federal authorities had shattered her remaining nerve. She tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically. Bradley stared at the camera lens mounted above the door. The realization finally hit him. He could not bully me. He could not gaslight me. He could not manipulate the narrative. I held the high ground and I possessed all the evidence. He turned away, practically dragging Cynthia down the walkway. They practically ran to their car. The silver sedan reversed out of the driveway so fast the tires squealed against the asphalt, leaving dark rubber marks on the street. I tapped the screen, ending the audio transmission. I took a slow sip of my chamomile tea. The physical confrontation was over, but I knew the war was far from finished. Desperate people do not simply surrender. They look for dirtier weapons. I knew exactly what they would try next, and I was fully prepared for Monday morning. The knock on my front door came precisely at 9 in the morning. It was not the aggressive pounding of an angry son. It was the firm, measured, professional knock of a state official. I opened the door to find 3 people standing on my porch. 2 women wearing practical business suits and carrying thick clipboards accompanied by a uniformed police officer. The badges clipped to the women's blazers clearly identified them. They were caseworkers for Adult Protective Services. Cynthia had deployed the ultimate, most toxic weapon in her arsenal. If she could not convince the neighbors that I was insane, she would try to use the power of the state to declare me legally incompetent. "Good morning," the lead caseworker said. Her tone was gentle, employing that specific patronizing cadence reserved for confused elderly patients. "Are you Helen?" I replied with a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come inside. It is chilly out there." The 3 of them stepped into my foyer. They looked around, their eyes scanning the environment. When Adult Protective Services receives a report of severe dementia and paranoia, they expect to walk into a disaster. They expect to find hoarding conditions, spoiled food, unwashed clothes, and a disoriented resident. Instead, they walked into a pristine, beautifully maintained home. The hardwood floors gleamed. The air smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and crisp slacks, looking ready to step into a corporate boardroom. Helen, the caseworker, began looking slightly thrown off by my appearance. "We received a very concerning emergency hotline call early this morning. A family member reported that you are suffering from severe cognitive decline. They stated you are experiencing paranoid delusions about your finances, that you have locked yourself inside, and that you are refusing essential medical care. We are here to conduct a wellness check and a competency evaluation." "I understand completely," I said, maintaining my gracious smile. "Please follow me to the dining room. I have a pot of fresh coffee brewing, and I think we have a great deal of financial documentation to discuss." The police officer exchanged a puzzled glance with the second caseworker, but they followed me down the hall. The dining room table was not set for a meal. It was set up like an active audit command center. 3 thick, heavy-duty binders lay perfectly aligned on the polished wood. Each binder was meticulously organized with color-coded tabs, index pages, and transparent document sleeves. "Please take a seat," I offered, pouring coffee into fine china cups. I assumed the emergency hotline call was placed by my daughter-in-law, Cynthia. The lead caseworker hesitated, clutching her clipboard. "The reporter's identity is strictly confidential." I laughed softly, taking my own seat at the head of the table. "You do not need to confirm it. Cynthia is currently facing a massive federal asset freeze due to a $1.2 million fraud scheme she executed on Friday. Calling your agency and claiming I have dementia is her final desperate attempt to discredit the victim before the federal indictment drops." The caseworkers stared at me. The gentle, patronizing tone vanished entirely from their demeanor. I pulled the first heavy binder toward the center of the table and opened it. I did not speak like an unstable grandmother. I spoke like the 35-year veteran forensic certified public accountant that I was. "Let us begin with the forged, durable power of attorney," I stated, flipping to the first tab. On the left, you will see the fraudulent document filed with the county clerk on Friday afternoon. Notice the notary stamp belonging to Todd Miller. On the right, you will see my sworn affidavit, my hotel receipts, and time-stamped security footage proving I was physically located in a different city when this document was allegedly signed. The lead caseworker slowly reached out and touched the documents. Her eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the undeniable objective proof. I opened the second binder. This contains the routing data for the $1.2 million home equity line of credit my son illegally extracted from this property. You will see the wire transfer receipts. $400,000 went to an offshore debt liquidator. $600,000 went to Cynthia's corporate escrow account to cover her ongoing embezzlement. The police officer leaned over the table, his posture completely rigid as he looked at the bank routing evidence. And finally, I said, placing my hand on the third thinnest binder. My voice lost its polite warmth, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. This contains the financial records for Caleb's college fund. My grandson was pressured into signing away his beneficiary rights, and $85,000 was removed shortly before his tuition came due. That theft is separate from the forged mortgage, but it shows the same pattern. Bradley and Cynthia were consuming family assets to hide their own financial collapse. The room was completely silent. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as the two social workers flipped through the meticulous, undeniable evidence of a massive financial crime. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They had not been sent here to protect a vulnerable elderly woman. They had been weaponized. A pair of desperate criminals had tried to use a state protection agency as an attack dog to intimidate a key witness. The lead caseworker closed the binder. Her face was flushed with professional outrage. She looked at the police officer who was already reaching for his radio. Helen, the caseworker, said, her voice shaking slightly with anger. I apologize for coming into your home under these pretenses. You are clearly not experiencing any cognitive decline. I appreciate you doing your job, I replied smoothly. The caseworker pulled a red pen from her pocket. She flipped to the front page of her official intake file. She drew a heavy dark line through the section labeled Cognitive Assessment. We are officially closing the medical wellness check, she announced firmly, and we are immediately opening a new high-priority state investigation. I am classifying this file as an extreme case of elder financial abuse. She handed the file to the police officer. Officer, she said, I need you to forward this entire dossier to the Financial Crimes Unit right now. Tell them Adult Protective Services is formally requesting an immediate criminal review of Bradley and Cynthia. The officer nodded, taking the file. I will make the call from the cruiser right now, ma'am. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. Cynthia thought she could break me by sending the authorities to my door. She completely forgot that when you invite the authorities to the scene of a crime, they tend to look at the actual criminals. My home was secure, my mind was sharp, and the full weight of the state investigative apparatus was now pointing directly at my son. By Monday afternoon, Richard and I were sitting in a quiet diner, waiting for the weakest link in Cynthia's chain. Todd pushed through the diner doors. I was a man perpetually out of his depth. At 40 years old, he still dressed like a college student, arriving late for an internship, wearing a slightly wrinkled dress shirt and a nervous, shifting expression. He had failed as a real estate agent, failed as a mortgage broker, and eventually settled for a modest living as a public notary. I was exactly the kind of weak, easily manipulated person Cynthia loved to keep around. He spotted me in the back booth and stopped dead in his tracks. He had been expecting to meet a prospective client who had promised him a lucrative contract over the phone. Instead, he saw the woman whose life he had just helped destroy. He turned his body toward the door, his flight instinct kicking in, but Richard stood up from the booth. Richard did not raise his voice. He simply projected the commanding, inescapable aura of a senior federal litigator. Sit down, Todd, Richard said. The coffee is already paid for, and the federal marshals are not waiting outside just yet. The color drained completely from Todd's face. He looked at the door, then back at us, before slowly shuffling over to the booth. He slid into the vinyl seat next to Richard, looking like a man walking to the gallows. His hands trembled as he placed them on the sticky laminate table. I did not know it was you, Helen. Todd stammered instantly, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate rush. Cynthia just handed me a stack of closing documents. She told me the client was waiting in the car and was too sick to walk up the stairs. I just stamped where she pointed. I swear I did not look at the names. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, letting the cold, analytical silence stretch between us until Todd looked away. "You are a licensed notary public for the state of Illinois," I stated softly. "Your sole legal function is to verify identity and witness signatures. You are not a rubber stamp for your sister's criminal enterprise." "I did not know," Todd pleaded, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You have to believe me." Richard pulled a sleek leather folder from his briefcase and laid it flat on the table. He flipped it open to reveal the exact documentation we had compiled over the weekend. He pointed a manicured finger at the fraudulent durable power of attorney. "This is your official state seal," Todd Richard said, his tone clinical and devastating. "This document was used to execute a $1.2 million fraudulent mortgage against a property that Helen owns free and clear. Because your seal is on this paper, you are no longer just a negligent notary. You are a primary accessory to massive federal wire fraud." Todd stared at the paperwork. His breathing became shallow and rapid. $1.2 million, he whispered. "Cynthia told me it was just a standard refinancing form to help Bradley consolidate. She gave me $500 cash for my trouble." $500, I repeated. My voice carried a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You sold your freedom for $500 while your sister orchestrated a $1 million heist. The state had already placed your notary commission under emergency suspension pending investigation." Richard continued without missing a beat. "The forged seal is now tied to a $1.2 million fraud file, and prosecutors are mapping the flow of the stolen funds. If you are treated as a knowing participant in the conspiracy, the prison exposure is measured in years, not months." Todd buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook as a quiet, pathetic sob escaped his throat. He was a coward, and cowards always break when the pressure becomes real. "I do not want to go to prison." Todd wept. "Please, Helen, I am not like them. I did not get any of the big money. I just did what my sister told me to do. She always bullies me into these things. She said if I did not help her, she would tell my wife about the money I borrowed from her last year." I looked at Richard. The lawyer gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. We had him exactly where we needed him. "The federal prosecutor only cares about the architects of the crime," Todd Richard explained smoothly. "They want Bradley and they want Cynthia. You are just a convenient pawn. But if you wait for them to arrest you, Cynthia will absolutely blame you for the forgery. She will claim you orchestrated the paperwork without her knowledge. Blood loyalty evaporates when the federal indictments arrive." "What do you want me to do?" Todd asked, looking up with desperate, tear-filled eyes. "I want you to become a witness for the state," I said. "I want you to hand over every single piece of correspondence between you and Cynthia regarding this transaction. Every text message, every voicemail, every email. If you provide the prosecutors with undeniable proof that Cynthia directed the forgery, Richard will personally arrange a meeting with the district attorney to secure your immunity." Todd did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He reached into his pocket with shaking hands, unlocked his smartphone, and slid it across the diner table toward me. "It is all in my email outbox," Todd said eagerly, desperately trying to save himself. "She emailed me the PDF of your forged signature on Thursday night. She told me to print it, stamp it, and bring it to the country club before the wedding rehearsal. She promised to pay off my car loan if I kept my mouth shut. The emails are right there. You can have all of it." I looked at the screen. The email thread was right in front of me, featuring Cynthia's corporate signature block directly below explicit instructions to commit a felony. The final wall of their defense had just crumbled. Cynthia thought family loyalty would protect her, but she had underestimated the survival instinct of a cornered coward. Richard picked up the phone, drafted a quick data transfer to his own secure server, and handed the device back to Todd. "Do not speak to your sister," Richard commanded. "Do not answer her calls. Do not reply to her texts. When the investigators contact you tomorrow morning, you will tell them exactly what you told us." We left Todd sitting alone in the diner booth, staring blankly at his cold coffee. The weak link had snapped effortlessly. Now it was time to handle the collateral damage. 2 days later, my new smart security system chimed softly in the kitchen. I checked the monitor mounted on the wall. A sleek black town car had pulled into my driveway. The passenger door opened, and Madison stepped out. My granddaughter looked stunning, sporting a fresh tan from her brief honeymoon in the Caribbean. She wore a bright floral sundress and expensive sunglasses. but her body language was rigid, and she slammed the car door shut with a violence that told me her vacation had not ended well. I unlocked the front door and waited on the porch. Madison marched up the walkway. She did not offer a greeting. She did not reach out for a hug. Her face was contorted with a mixture of profound embarrassment and deep, searing anger. "What did you do?" Grandma Madison demanded, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. I gestured toward the open door. "Come inside, Madison. We are not having this conversation on the front lawn." She crossed her arms, but followed me into the house. I led her into the sunroom at the back of the property. It was a bright, peaceful room filled with potted plants and comfortable wicker furniture. The heavy wooden table in the center of the room, however, was covered in printed banking statements and legal filings. Madison stood aggressively on the other side of the table. "Mark and I were humiliated yesterday," she snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "We tried to check out of our resort in the Bahamas, and the hotel manager told us the credit card Dad gave us for the trip was completely frozen. He said it was flagged for federal fraud. We had to sit in the lobby for 4 hours while Mark begged his parents to wire us emergency cash just so we could get to the airport." I poured a glass of iced water and pushed it across the table toward her. "Mom called me in hysterics this morning." Madison continued, ignoring the water. "She said you have gone completely insane. She said you filed false police reports and froze all their accounts because you were angry about a seating mix-up at the church. She said you are trying to destroy our family over a petty grudge." I looked at my granddaughter. She was 24 years old, deeply sheltered, and entirely dependent on the illusion of her parents' wealth. She believed the polished facade they projected to the world. Breaking that illusion was going to cause her immense pain, but protecting her from the truth was no longer an option. "Sit down, Madison," I said. My tone left absolutely no room for argument. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into a chair. "I did not freeze their accounts over a seating chart," I explained calmly. "I froze their accounts because while you were standing at the altar exchanging vows, your parents were stealing this house." Madison frowned. "That is impossible. Dad makes $500,000 a year. They do not need your house." I pulled the first stack of documents across the table and turned them so they faced her. "I want you to look at the numbers, Madison. Look at the date on this home equity loan and look at the forged signature at the bottom. Then look at the confession email from your Uncle Todd confirming that your mother directed the forgery." Madison's eyes drifted down to the papers. She recognized her uncle's email address. She recognized the date of her wedding. The initial spark of defensive anger in her eyes began to waver, replaced by a terrible creeping uncertainty. "Your father does not make $500,000 a year," I told her gently. "He has been drowning in commercial debt for 3 years. He owed hundreds of thousands to shadow liquidators. And your mother has been systematically embezzling money from her own real estate clients to fund her expensive lifestyle. The State Banking Commission notified her of an impending audit last week. They needed cash immediately to avoid federal prison." Madison shook her head slowly. "No. No, they paid for my entire wedding. They paid for the country club. They bought my dress. They have money." "They paid for your wedding using stolen funds," I corrected her. "Every beautiful flower arrangement, every bottle of champagne, and the custom dress you wore down the aisle were financed by criminal activity." I slid the final folder across the table. It was the hardest evidence to show her because it connected the beautiful details of her wedding to money that had never belonged to her parents. Inside were 2 sets of records. The first belonged to Caleb's college fund, the account I had started when he was a child and later allowed Bradley to manage. The second traced withdrawals from a retirement reserve my late husband had built for family security before he died. "When your parents started running out of legitimate cash," I explained softly, "they did not cut expenses. They started consuming the funds they believed nobody would challenge them over. Open the folder, Madison. Look at the dates." Her hand trembled as she turned the first page. Caleb's college account had held $85,000. The statement showed the withdrawal shortly before the wedding and the transfer into an account controlled by Bradley. On the next pages were payments tied to wedding expenses, deposits to vendors' charges, connected to the reception, and money used to cover the custom dress and other costs your parents had proudly claimed they could afford. Additional entries were traced to the retirement reserve my husband had left behind. "They used Grandpa's retirement money for my wedding," she whispered, "and Caleb's tuition money." "Yes," I said. "The generosity you thought you were receiving was financed by money taken from the people standing closest to you. Caleb trusted his parents to protect his education. Your grandfather built that reserve to protect this family after he was gone. Bradley and Cynthia treated both as private cash drawers. A tear fell onto the college statement. Madison pressed her fingertips against her mouth as the last piece of the illusion collapsed. "But Caleb needs that money for school," she said. "He does," I answered, and they knew it. She bent forward and cried with the deep, disorienting grief of someone realizing that a treasured memory had been built on theft. I moved around the table and rested a hand on her shoulder. I did not tell her she had been foolish. She had been lied to by the two people she had been taught to trust most. "What happens now, Grandma?" she asked. "Now you decide what kind of life you want," I said. "You can defend the image your parents created, or you can stand with Caleb and me and help rebuild what they damaged." Madison looked down at the empty college account and the retirement statements. She wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and spoke with a certainty I had never heard from her before. "I am done defending them. I am standing with you and Caleb." The last remaining pillar of Bradley's perfect family facade had collapsed. He had lost the obedience of the children he had controlled, and the isolation he had created around himself was finally complete. That evening, Caleb came by after class. He found me in the office organizing the evidence from Todd's confession. He did not ask what Madison had said. He could read the answer on my face. I told him she had seen the records and chosen to stand with us. For the first time since the wedding, some of the tension left his shoulders. Then his laptop made a sharp electronic sound from inside his backpack. Caleb froze. That was not a normal notification. He set the backpack on my desk, pulled out the computer, and opened a monitoring window I had never seen before. A line of new activity was appearing in real time. Caleb looked at me suddenly pale. "Grandma," he said, "Dad is using the laptop." I stared at the screen. "I thought you cloned the laptop at the hotel." "I did," Caleb replied. And while the copy was running, I installed a lightweight keystroke logger on the machine. I knew he would change passwords if he realized files were missing, so I wanted a way to see whether he tried to delete evidence. It does not control his computer. It only records what he types and sends me an alert when certain financial keywords appear. I did not praise him. I did not scold him. At that moment, the question was not whether a 19-year-old had made a perfect legal decision in a panic. The question was what Bradley was trying to do while a federal freeze order was already hanging over him. On Caleb's screen, a series of keystrokes appeared. Bradley had opened the online portal for the dormant reserve account I had flagged during the midnight audit. The account still held the last $200,000 from the fraudulent home equity loan. The emergency freeze had locked the ordinary outgoing channels, but Bradley was searching for a path around them. He typed the name of a cryptocurrency exchange into the browser. Then he entered credentials for an account neither Caleb nor I had seen in the copied files. "Richard," I said. Caleb was already calling him. Richard answered on the first ring. Caleb put the phone on speaker and described exactly what was happening. Richard's voice lost all traces of fatigue. "Do not touch Bradley's computer," he ordered. "Do not send him a message. Do not attempt to log into the crypto account. Preserve the keystrokes exactly as they arrive. Helen, open the reserve account record from your trace and confirm whether the $200,000 is still there." I did. The balance was unchanged, but a new authorization request had appeared. Bradley was trying to convert the money into a transfer that would move outside the normal banking rails. The destination was a newly created digital asset account. He had apparently believed that if he could turn the final reserve into cryptocurrency and move it again quickly enough, the court would have difficulty following it. I was wrong. During our all-night preparation before the country club brunch, Caleb had built more than a complaint script for Todd. At Richard's direction, he had also created a monitoring routine that watched the known routing identifiers connected to the stolen loan. The routine could not seize money, and it could not order a bank to do anything. What it could do was immediately package any new attempted transfer, attach the federal freeze order already issued by the court, and send an automated high-priority fraud notice to the bank's designated compliance channel and to Richard's secure case mailbox. In other words, Bradley was trying to escape through a door that already had a silent alarm wired to it. The alert fired. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the authorization request on my screen changed from pending to rejected. A second line appeared beneath it, transaction blocked under legal restriction. Caleb let out the breath he had been holding. Bradley tried again. The second attempt failed even faster. Then the keystroke log filled with angry fragments. Bradley typed a new amount, then another. He tried 50,000. He tried 99,000. He tried breaking the transfer into smaller pieces. Each request struck the same wall. The freeze order was attached to the account, and Caleb's monitoring routine was making sure the compliance team saw every attempt before Bradley could disguise it as ordinary activity. Richard spoke from the phone with the calm satisfaction of a man watching a defendant write his own confession. Save everything, he said. Every timestamp, every rejected authorization, every destination identifier. This is no longer merely evidence that he stole money. This is evidence that after receiving notice of a federal freeze, he deliberately attempted to move restricted assets into a channel he believed would be harder to trace. Flight risk, Caleb said quietly. And consciousness of guilt, Richard answered. He just gave us both. The keystroke stopped for almost a minute. Then one final line appeared. Bradley had typed a search phrase asking how quickly cryptocurrency could be transferred to an account outside the United States. I stared at the words. My son was not trying to pay a household bill. He was preparing an exit. I felt no shock this time. That part of me had been exhausted days earlier. What I felt was a cold sense of completion. Every time Bradley was given a chance to stop, he chose another act of deception. Every time the truth closed, one path he searched for a darker one. Caleb exported the log into a read-only file and generated a hash value, so any later alteration would be detectable. Richard instructed him to preserve the original data separately and stop watching once the transaction attempts ended. We were not going to turn a clean case into a debate about amateur surveillance. The bank's own records would independently prove the attempted transfers. Caleb's alert had simply made sure those records were captured while the attempt was happening. Within the hour, Richard forwarded the bank's rejection notices and account activity to the authorities already handling the financial fraud file. The response came quickly. The attempted movement of the final $200,000 was added to the case as evidence that Bradley was actively trying to dissipate restricted assets and potentially flee. The same money he had hoped would finance his escape had instead tightened the legal net around him. The next morning, I put on a dark navy suit and drove downtown with Richard. We were not going to Bradley's office. We were going to Sterling Prestige Realty. The brokerage occupied several polished floors of a glass office tower. Cynthia had spent years using that place as a stage for the image she wanted the world to believe. Disciplined, elegant, successful, trusted, with expensive homes and wealthy clients. By the time Richard and I stepped out of the elevator, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations stopped. Assistants looked down at their desks. Two brokers near the reception area whispered to each other and then fell silent when they recognized me. The scandal from the country club had traveled faster than any formal notice. I did not enjoy their stares. Public humiliation was Bradley and Cynthia's language, not mine. I was there for evidence. Richard had requested a meeting with Cynthia's managing partner and corporate counsel. We were shown into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The managing partner entered carrying a tablet and a legal pad. He looked guarded rather than hostile. He had already heard that Cynthia's accounts were frozen and that state auditors had questions about the firm's escrow balances. What he did not yet know was exactly how the $600,000 had appeared. I placed one binder on the table. I am not here to damage your company, I told him. I am here because your company may already be a victim. That changed his expression. I opened to the wire trace. The first page showed the fraudulent $1.2 million home equity loan secured against my property. The second showed the $600,000 transfer from Bradley's holding account into Sterling Prestige Realty's trust structure. The third showed the timing the money arrived immediately before the scheduled state review of Cynthia's escrow records. The managing partner leaned forward. That deposit was described internally as a temporary reconciliation transfer, he said. From whom, Richard asked. The man looked at the transaction record on his tablet. Cynthia authorized the entry. I slid Todd's email thread across the table next. It showed Cynthia directing her brother to notarize the forged power of attorney. Then I placed the state audit notice beside it. The $600,000 did not come from Cynthia, I said. It came from equity stolen from my house. If that money was used to restore missing client escrow funds, then your books may look balanced while the underlying source is criminal. For several seconds, no one spoke. The managing partner stood and walked to a cabinet at the side of the room. He retrieved a printed internal ledger and returned to the table. He compared dates. His finger moved down the columns once, then again. The color slowly drained from his face. "There are 6 escrow files with unexplained timing gaps," he said. Richard did not react. "How large are the gaps?" The managing partner added the amounts on his calculator. When he looked up, his face was rigid. "Just under 600,000. The room became silent enough that I could hear the ventilation system. He turned to me. "Mrs. Helen, did you authorize any money to be transferred here?" "No." "Did you authorize your son or Cynthia to borrow against your home?" "No." "Did you sign the power of attorney?" "No." Richard placed a copy of my Springfield records on the table. At the exact time the power of attorney claims, Helen appeared before the notary she was documented in another city. The managing partner closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, professional caution had been replaced by anger. Cynthia had not merely endangered herself. She had placed every broker, every client, and the entire firm's license at risk. The conference room door opened before he could speak again. Cynthia stood there. She had clearly been told I was in the building. The polished woman from the wedding was gone. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, her face was drawn, and she carried a stack of folders against her chest. The moment she saw my binder on the table, fury ignited in her eyes. "You," she said. The managing partner rose. "Cynthia, this is a confidential meeting. You need to wait outside." She ignored him. She pointed directly at me. "This woman is obsessed with destroying me. She has been harassing my family for days. She froze our accounts, manipulated my children, and now she is coming into my workplace to spread lies." I remained seated. Richard did not. He stepped between Cynthia and the table with the calm posture of an attorney who had spent his life around people making catastrophic statements in front of witnesses. "Be very careful what you say next," he told her. Cynthia laughed sharply. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "No," Richard replied. "I think you should be afraid of the documents." The managing partner lifted the wire trace. "Cynthia," he said, "I need you to explain why $600,000, originating from a fraudulent mortgage on Helen's property, was entered into our escrow structure immediately before the state audit." For the first time, Cynthia stopped moving. Her eyes flicked from the paper to me, then to Richard, then back to her boss. She tried to recover. "That was a family loan," she said. "Bradley arranged it." Helen agreed. I opened the folder containing Todd's emails and pushed it across the table. "Your brother says otherwise." Cynthia saw the first page. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The managing partner began reading. Each line stripped away another piece of her defense. Todd had written that Cynthia sent him the forged signature. Cynthia had told him where to stamp. Cynthia had promised to pay him for keeping quiet. There was no family misunderstanding left to hide behind. She snapped. "You weak little coward," she screamed, no longer speaking to anyone in the room, so much as raging at the absent brother who had betrayed her. Then she turned on me. "This is your fault. You could have just helped us. You have more than enough money. You were going to leave the house to Bradley eventually. What difference did it make if we used it now?" That sentence did more damage to her than any accusation I could have made. The managing partner stared at her. "Used it now," he repeated. Cynthia realized what she had said. She tried to reverse course, but panic had destroyed her discipline. She accused Bradley of pressuring her. She accused Todd of falsifying the documents without permission. She accused the bank of mishandling the loan. Then she accused me of being selfish for refusing to sacrifice my property to protect her career. I listened without interrupting. Sweet revenge is not always a shouted victory. Sometimes it is simply allowing a liar enough silence to expose herself. The managing partner pressed a button on the conference phone and requested security. He then looked at Cynthia with a level expression. "Effective immediately, your access to all client escrow systems is revoked. Your employment authority is suspended pending termination procedures. Our counsel will preserve your email transaction records and device access logs. We are also filing a formal complaint regarding the missing escrow funds and cooperating fully with state and federal investigators." Cynthia stared at him as though he had struck her. "You cannot do that," she said. "I have to," he replied. "You put client money and this firm's license at risk." Security arrived at the doorway. Cynthia refused to move at first. Her voice rose until people outside the conference room could hear every word. She shouted that the firm owed its reputation to her. She called me vindictive. She demanded that Richard stop smiling even though he was not smiling at all. The managing partner did not argue. He instructed security to escort her from the building and collect her access badge. As Cynthia was led through the open office, every employee she had once commanded could see what remained of her carefully manufactured status. No expensive dress, no platinum card, no polished speech could change the ledger. The woman who had used stolen money to make herself look successful was being removed from the very institution whose trust she had abused. I stayed in the conference room. I did not follow her to the elevator. I did not need to watch the final humiliation. The managing partner signed a written acknowledgement that the firm would preserve all escrow records and provide them to investigators. Richard gathered our copies and placed them back in his briefcase. When we stepped outside the Chicago wind, cut between the buildings, my phone vibrated with a message from Caleb. The bank had issued a formal preservation notice covering Bradley's failed $200,000 crypto transfer. The attempted escape was now part of the official record. Richard read the message over my shoulder. Tomorrow's emergency hearing just became much worse for them, he said. I looked up at the courthouse several blocks away. Bradley and Cynthia had spent the week trying to turn me into the defendant, an irrational mother, a confused old woman, a vindictive grandmother. Now Todd had given us the forgery instructions the bank had captured Bradley, trying to move frozen money, and Cynthia's own employer had documented the escrow shortage. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The next morning, the heavy oak doors of the Cook County Courthouse slammed shut behind me, sealing us inside a room that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The air conditioning hummed a steady low note that barely masked the tension radiating from the defense table. Bradley sat beside his high-priced attorney, wearing a gray suit that looked slightly too large for his shrinking frame. His usual arrogant posture had collapsed into a nervous slouch. He stared down at his folded hands and refused to look at me. The emergency hearing commenced immediately. The defense attorney stood up and confidently approached the center podium. He was a polished man who made his living spinning tragic fabricated tales to sympathetic judges. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed story about a grieving widow whose mind was tragically failing. He weaponized words like cognitive decline, paranoia, and maternal confusion. He painted a masterful picture of a generous, deeply concerned son stepping in to manage complex financial affairs for a mother who could no longer handle her own daily routine. According to his narrative, I had willingly signed the durable power of attorney during a rare moment of lucid clarity. He claimed I fully understood the $1.2 million transaction at the time, only to forget the entire arrangement days later due to my rapidly advancing age. He told the court with a perfectly practiced expression of sorrow that I was acting out of bitter spite, lashing out at the very family members who only wanted to protect me from my own deteriorating mind. Richard sat calmly beside me at the plaintiff table. He did not object to the defense attorney's theatrical performance. He simply let the man dig a massive, inescapable hole. When the defense finally concluded their opening statement, Richard stood up slowly. He did not offer a fiery rebuttal. He simply invited me to take the witness stand. I walked to the front of the courtroom. My heels clicked with absolute precision against the polished hardwood floor. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the whole truth. I sat down in the wooden chair and adjusted the microphone. I did not look like a confused, bitter old woman. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had spent 3.5 decades dissecting corporate lies for a living. Richard approached the witness stand. He asked me to state my name and my occupation for the official court record. I told the judge I was a forensic certified public accountant with 35 years of experience investigating major commercial tax fraud. The defense attorney shifted very uncomfortably in his seat. Richard handed me a physical copy of the forged power of attorney. He asked me to read the exact time and date stamped directly next to the fraudulent notary seal. I read the timestamp aloud so the court reporter could capture every syllable. 2:15 in the afternoon on Friday, October 12th. Richard asked where I was at that precise moment. I did not talk about motherhood betrayal or a broken heart. I spoke the cold, undeniable language of forensic reality. I told the court that at 2:15 in the afternoon on that specific Friday, I was exactly 212 miles away from my home in Chicago. I pulled a pristine, color-coded portfolio from my lap and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. Inside that folder was my complete, airtight alibi. I was sitting inside a highly secure conference room at the Illinois Department of Revenue headquarters in Springfield. I was conducting a joint tax review with the Senior Director of State Audits. My portfolio contained the government building security sign in logs bearing my authentic signature. It contained my electronic tollway transponder records showing my vehicle crossing multiple state checkpoints on the highway. Most importantly, it contained a sworn notarized affidavit from the state tax director himself. He legally confirmed that I was sitting directly across a table from him at the exact moment my son claimed I was signing my house away in the suburbs of Chicago. The defense attorney stared at the copies of my evidence. All the remaining color drained from his face. He looked down at Bradley with an expression of absolute, unfiltered disgust. A smart lawyer can defend a genuine mistake, but no lawyer can defend a poorly constructed lie against a mountain of irrefutable forensic proof. The judge did not even bother asking the defense for a rebuttal. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at my son from her elevated bench with pure, chilling contempt. She brought her wooden gavel down with a sharp cracking sound that echoed like a gunshot. She explicitly rejected every single motion filed by the defense. She ordered the temporary federal asset freeze to become permanent and irrevocable. Then she leaned forward and delivered the killing blow. She announced that due to the overwhelming documented evidence of deliberate forgery, elder abuse, and wire fraud, she was formally binding the entire case file over to the state attorney general for immediate criminal prosecution. The civil hearing was officially over. The criminal nightmare for my son had just begun. I walked out of the courtroom with Richard by my side. We bypassed the crowded elevators and took the stairs down to the underground parking garage. The concrete walls echoed heavily with the sound of our footsteps. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the gray pavement. The air smelled of vehicle exhaust and damp concrete. As we approached Richard's parked car, I heard a frantic, panicked whispering echoing from the darkness. Bradley was standing near a massive concrete structural pillar, clutching his cell phone tightly to his ear. He had slipped out of the courtroom a few minutes before us, desperately trying to do damage control. His body was trembling so violently that he could barely hold the device against his face. The federal injunction had frozen every bank account and credit line tied to his name, but a court order meant nothing to the shadow creditors he owed. Bradley had promised them $400,000. The original payment to the debt liquidator had been caught in the freeze before final settlement, leaving the creditors unpaid and furious. They did not care why the money was inaccessible. They only cared that Bradley had promised cash and failed to deliver. The money was locked in a banking vault, permanently untouchable. The men on the other end of the phone wanted their cash, and they wanted it today. "Please," Bradley whimpered into the phone, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Just give me 48 hours. My accounts are locked up in a legal dispute, but I can get the money. I swear I can get the cash. You do not need to come to the house. Please." The person on the other end of the line clearly did not agree to an extension. The call disconnected abruptly. Bradley let out a choked, devastated gasp. He dropped the phone. It clattered against the pavement, the screen cracking upon impact. He turned around and saw me walking toward the car. The arrogant, polished regional manager who had hosted a lavish country club brunch was completely gone. The man standing in front of me in the dim garage was a hollow, broken shell of a human being. He stumbled across the parking garage, his legs barely able to support his own weight. He did not yell. He did not try to gaslight me or play the victim anymore. The illusion was shattered. Bradley threw himself onto the dirty concrete floor of the parking garage. He landed hard on his knees right in front of my shoes. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my winter coat with both hands. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the heavy sweat on his cheeks. He was hyperventilating, practically choking on his own desperate sobs. "Mom, please," he begged. His voice echoed miserably off the concrete walls. "You have to lift the freeze. You have to go back upstairs and tell the judge you made a mistake. Just let the $400,000 go through. I will give you the house back. I will sign whatever you want. I will go away forever. But you have to release that one wire transfer." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They are going to kill me," he cried out, shaking my coat. "You do not know who these people are. They know where I live. They know where Madison lives. If I do not pay them by tonight, they are going to murder me. Please, Mom, you are my mother. You have to save me." I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt. This was the same man who had stolen my 19-year-old grandson's college fund. This was the exact same man who had orchestrated a meticulous plan to throw me out of my own home and have me declared confused and incapable just so he could maintain his wealthy lifestyle. He was begging for his life using the very title of mother that he had completely disregarded when he thought he was holding all the winning cards. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel residual anger. I felt nothing but a deep, unshakable, profound peace. I gently pulled the fabric of my coat out of his grasping, sweaty hands. I took a half step back and looked him directly in his tear-filled eyes. "When you blocked me at the heavy oak doors of the church on your daughter's wedding day," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm, You looked me right in the eye and you told me I was not on the list." Bradley stared up at me, his chest heaving as he sobbed on the cold floor. Well, I continued stepping around his kneeling body. "Now you are not on my list either." I walked to the passenger side of Richard's car and climbed gracefully inside. I pulled the heavy door shut. The thick safety glass immediately muted the pathetic sounds of my son crying on the concrete. I pressed the button to roll the window all the way up, sealing out the noise of his destruction completely. Richard started the engine, shifted the car into gear, and drove us smoothly out of the dark parking garage into the bright afternoon sunlight. We left Bradley entirely alone in the shadows he had created for himself. The drive away from the courthouse left me feeling entirely drained, but my work was not yet finished. I returned to my home office while the afternoon sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the hardwood floors. I turned on my desk lamp and opened a fresh box of heavy legal folders. Civil court was a temporary bandage. A state judge could freeze their assets, and local police could investigate the forged notary stamp, but those processes took months of painful, tedious litigation. Bradley and Cynthia were desperate. Desperate people find loopholes. They manipulate local jurisdictions, hire sleazy defense attorneys, and drag their victims through years of agonizing depositions and appeals. I was not going to allow my son the luxury of time. I was going to drop an anvil on his life that no defense attorney in the country could lift. I picked up my phone and called Richard. I told him to arrange a meeting with his top contacts at the federal building in downtown Chicago. We were taking this entire conspiracy to the highest possible authority. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division does not care about family drama. They do not care about tearful sob stories, broken childhoods, or underground gambling addictions. They only care about the numbers, and the numbers my son had generated were a federal prosecutor's absolute dream. For a decade, Bradley had lived far beyond his actual means, funding his luxury cars and country club memberships with unreported shadow loans and illicit offshore wire transfers. Cynthia had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen client escrow funds through their joint personal accounts to cover the gaps. In the eyes of the federal government, this was not just elder abuse. It was organized money laundering, federal wire fraud, and massive systemic tax evasion. You can sometimes negotiate a civil fraud settlement with a local judge. You cannot negotiate with the federal government when they have your complete digital ledger proving you hid stolen millions from the Treasury. Early the following Monday morning, Richard and I walked through the heavy revolving doors of the federal building. We were escorted past the crowded public waiting areas and brought directly into a highly secure, windowless conference room on the upper floors. Waiting for us was a senior special agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit alongside a seasoned assistant United States attorney. They wore plain, immaculate suits and carried themselves with the quiet, overwhelming authority of people who put corrupt billionaires in prison for a living. I did not waste their time with emotional appeals or maternal grievances. I opened my pristine color-coded binders and laid them out across the large metal table. I walked them through the exact timeline of the $1.2 million fraudulent mortgage. I provided the offshore routing numbers Bradley had used to funnel money to his shadow creditors. I showed them the exact sequence of deposits Cynthia had made using stolen real estate escrow funds. I handed them a completed, flawless forensic audit that would have taken their own department 6 months to build from scratch. The federal agents reviewed the documents in absolute silence. The special agent traced his finger down the column of Cynthia's fraudulent banking deposits. He looked at the offshore wire transfer receipts Bradley had initiated. The paper trail was absolute. There were no missing links, no vague assumptions. I had provided the dates, the times, the Internet Protocol addresses, and the exact dollar amounts down to the final cent. When you hand the federal government a perfectly wrapped gift of irrefutable tax evasion and money laundering evidence, they do not hesitate. The assistant United States attorney closed the final binder. He looked across the table at me with a mixture of deep professional respect and quiet, unspoken sympathy. He recognized exactly what I was doing. I was handing over my own flesh and blood to the federal penitentiary system. The prosecutor stood up from the table. He gathered the heavy binders and tucked them securely under his arm. He told Richard and me that the financial threshold for a federal indictment had been vastly exceeded. The offshore wire transfers triggered immediate federal jurisdiction, and the escrow theft elevated the entire conspiracy to a major syndicate financial crime. He thanked me for my incredible thoroughness. He stated that they would not need months to present this evidence to a grand jury. The documentation was so complete and the flight risk was so severe, given Bradley's frantic attempt to wire funds offshore, that they could move immediately. The prosecutor pulled out his cell phone as he walked toward the heavy wooden door. He told the special agent to assemble an early morning strike team. A federal arrest warrant was being drafted at that very moment, and a federal magistrate would sign it before midnight. The hammer was officially falling, and there was nothing Bradley could do to stop it. The affluent neighborhood where Bradley and Cynthia lived was famous for its pristine, uninterrupted silence. It was a wealthy, gated community filled with manicured lawns, sprawling mansions, and arrogant neighbors who prided themselves on their perfect, undisturbed lives. At exactly 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning, that beautiful silence was violently, permanently shattered. A convoy of black, unmarked sports utility vehicles rolled seamlessly through the community gates. They did not use their loud sirens, but the heavy rumble of their engines and the flashing red and blue lights, reflecting off the darkened residential windows, woke the entire street. The federal vehicles swarmed Bradley's massive driveway, blocking his expensive luxury cars and sealing off every possible avenue of escape. Over a dozen federal agents stepped out into the crisp, freezing morning air. They wore heavy tactical gear over their plain clothes, their dark windbreakers prominently emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They did not politely ring the doorbell or wait for an invitation. 2 armed agents moved swiftly to the perimeter, securing the backyard and the side gates, while the lead agent approached the custom mahogany double doors of my son's house. He pounded his heavy fist against the expensive wood. The sound echoed like cannon fire across the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. When the door finally opened, the agents flooded the grand foyer, their voices shouting clear, authoritative commands that left no room for resistance. I was not there to watch it happen. I did not want to stand on the cold sidewalk and gloat over the brutal destruction of my own child. I was sitting at my kitchen table miles away, holding a warm cup of tea and looking out at the pale light of the rising sun. Richard was parked down the street from Bradley's house, observing the federal raid from a safe, discreet distance, and he called me to relay the events exactly as they unfolded. The wealthy neighbors who had attended the lavish country club brunch just days earlier were now standing on their front porches in their expensive bathrobes. They were peering through their sheer curtains and standing at the edges of their driveways, watching the ultimate devastating humiliation of the couple who had desperately tried to buy their respect and admiration. Through the phone, Richard described the scene with cold, clinical precision. Bradley was led out the front door first. He was not wearing his custom-tailored suits or his expensive Italian leather shoes. He was wearing wrinkled gray sweatpants and a rumpled white t-shirt. His hands were securely handcuffed behind his back. The arrogant, boastful man who had barred me from his daughter's wedding looked incredibly small, terrified, and fragile as 2 federal agents marched him down his own front walkway. The illusion of his wealth and limitless power was entirely gone. He kept his head down, staring at the concrete pavement, absolutely refusing to look at the wealthy neighbors who were whispering and pointing from their manicured lawns. Sitting in my quiet kitchen, listening to Richard describe the arrest, I felt a deep, overwhelming emptiness settle heavily into my chest. There was absolutely no joy in this victory. There was no triumphant satisfaction in knowing my son was going to a federal prison. It was a profound, devastating tragedy. I had held Bradley in my arms when he was a helpless baby. I had taught him how to walk, how to read his first books, and how to ride a bicycle. To realize that the boy I raised had transformed into a ruthless, calculating predator who would gladly destroy his own mother for cash was a heartbreak that no amount of justice could ever truly heal. But being a mother does not mean blindly excusing evil. It means knowing exactly when the limits of unconditional love have been crossed and having the terrible strength to protect the innocent people left in the wake of that destruction. Then Richard's voice on the phone suddenly shifted. The tone became sharp alert and laced with pure disbelief. Cynthia was being brought out of the house. She was wearing expensive silk pajamas, her styled hair now a messy, tangled disaster. She was fighting the agents, thrashing her shoulders and screaming frantically as they guided her down the concrete steps in tight handcuffs. As they led her past Bradley toward a separate federal transport vehicle, the last remaining thread of their toxic, fraudulent alliance completely snapped. Cynthia stopped fighting the federal agents and turned her absolute venomous fury entirely onto her husband. Her screams echoed piercingly through the quiet suburban street, perfectly audible to every stunned neighbor and federal agent present. She shrieked that this was entirely his fault. She screamed that his reckless gambling debts and his dangerous shadow loans were the only reason she had ever touched her client escrow accounts. She cursed him, crying hysterically, telling the arresting officers that Bradley had forced her to forge my signature and that she was merely a helpless victim of his psychological manipulation. Bradley stopped walking and stared at his wife in pure, shocked horror. The united, arrogant front they had maintained to rob me and ruin Caleb's life dissolved into a vicious, ugly display of desperate self-preservation. They were turning on each other right there on the front lawn, tearing their marriage apart piece by piece to save their own skin. Richard quietly ended the call, leaving me alone in the profound silence of my home. The trap had permanently closed, the criminals were in heavy chains, and the long, painful process of rebuilding what they had broken could finally begin. The recovery process began exactly where the crime had originated. It started inside a heavily air-conditioned, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of a major commercial bank in downtown Chicago. I sat at one end of a massive, polished granite table. Richard sat calmly to my right, his leather briefcase resting by his feet. Sitting across from us were the Senior Vice President of Lending and the Chief Compliance Officer for the entire Midwest region. They both looked incredibly uncomfortable. Their tailored suits could not hide the nervous, erratic shifting of their hands. Banks do not like to lose money, and they absolutely despise admitting fault. For the first 20 minutes of the meeting, their corporate counsel attempted to construct a narrative where the bank was simply an innocent victim of a sophisticated family dispute. They tried to suggest that because the $1.2 million loan had already been disbursed, my estate would have to navigate a complex civil litigation process to remove the lien from my property. They used a tremendous amount of legal jargon designed to intimidate an ordinary civilian into accepting a prolonged, expensive settlement. They completely forgot who was sitting across the table. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my color-coded portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth granite surface. It was a copy of the federal indictment bearing my son's name alongside the sworn confession from the disgraced notary public. I looked directly into the eyes of the Chief Compliance Officer. I explained to him using the precise clinical terminology of a seasoned forensic auditor exactly how his underwriting department had failed. I detailed how their loan officers had neglected to verify the digital metadata on the power of attorney. I pointed out that they had approved a 7-figure equity extraction without placing a single verification phone call to the primary title holder. I made it explicitly clear that if they did not instantly void the fraudulent mortgage and release the lien on my home, Richard would file a gross negligence lawsuit before the stock market closed. I promised them a highly public trial that would humiliate their entire risk management division. The corporate counsel stopped talking. The vice president of lending wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. 10 minutes later, they produced a formal release of lien document. They absorbed the massive financial loss entirely. My home was safe, the debt was completely erased, and the bank was left to fight over the scraps of whatever assets the federal government had not already seized from my son. Securing the house was only the first step. I needed to guarantee that my life's work would never be vulnerable to another attack. That afternoon, Richard and I returned to his law office to completely restructure my estate. I directed him to draft the paperwork for a new ironclad irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard living will, an irrevocable trust creates an absolute legal fortress. Once my assets, my home, and my investment portfolios were transferred into this specific trust, they were no longer legally mine to give away on a whim. They belonged to the trust itself. No forged signature, no fraudulent power of attorney, and no desperate relative could ever pierce that corporate veil. To ensure ultimate security, I appointed Richard as the legal CO trustee. From that day forward, any significant financial maneuver regarding my estate would require both of our verified in-person signatures. I had built a permanent, impenetrable wall around my future. The final chapter of this legal nightmare took place 6 months later inside a federal courtroom. The atmosphere in a federal sentencing hearing is incredibly sterile and heavy. There are no dramatic outbursts, no surprise witnesses, and no last-minute theatrics. There was only the cold, mechanical delivery of justice. I sat in the second row of the wooden gallery benches. I watched the heavy side door open. Bradley and Cynthia were led into the courtroom by armed federal marshals. They were stripped of all their suburban armor. There were no tailored tuxedos, no emerald green designer dresses, and no platinum credit cards. They wore identical loose-fitting orange prison jumpsuits. Their hands were secured in heavy metal chains that rattled loudly in the quiet room. Cynthia's hair was graying at the roots, her posture completely slumped. Bradley looked hollowed out. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and exhausted. When the judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, Bradley looked back at the gallery. He looked directly at me. His eyes filled with tears and his mouth trembled. He tried to articulate an apology, tried to say he was sorry for everything he had broken, but the words caught in his throat. I looked back at my son. I felt no triumphant joy. I felt no vindictive thrill. I only felt a profound, heavy sorrow. Watching your own child walk to their ruin is a tragedy that defies description. But true love does not mean shielding a criminal from the consequences of their devastation. It means honoring the boundaries of respect and protecting the innocent people they tried to destroy. The federal judge did not offer sympathy. He read the verdict with a booming absolute authority for the crimes of organized wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Bradley was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Cynthia, for her role in the massive escrow embezzlement and the real estate fraud, was sentenced to 6 years. The gavel struck the wooden block. The sharp sound echoed through the high ceilings. The marshals placed their hands on Bradley and Cynthia's shoulders, guiding them toward the holding cells. Everything they had desperately tried to steal had ultimately cost them the one thing they could never buy back: their freedom. With the legal battles officially concluded, the heavy dust of the past year finally began to settle. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, quiet landscape where true healing could take root. A week after the sentencing, I invited Caleb to my home. My 19-year-old grandson walked through the front door carrying his heavy college backpack. He had spent the last several months navigating the emotional wreckage of his parents' destruction. He had testified honestly to the authorities, provided the digital evidence that secured the indictments, and stood bravely by my side through the entire ordeal. But he was also a young man who had lost his family unit, and he carried that grief with a quiet, stoic dignity. I guided Caleb into the dining room and asked him to sit down at the large mahogany table, the same table where I had built the forensic trap that caught his parents. I placed a thick, sealed white envelope right in front of him. "Open it," I told him gently. Caleb looked confused. He broke the seal and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. It was not a personal check. It was the official documentation for a newly established, fully funded educational trust account. The balance at the bottom of the summary page read exactly $150,000. I looked at his shocked, wide eyes. I had not just replaced the $85,000 his parents had stolen. I had fully funded the remainder of his undergraduate degree and established a modest emergency reserve so his education would never again depend on anyone else's promises. Grandma, Caleb whispered, his hands trembling as he held the financial papers. "I cannot take this. It is too much. You have already done so much for me." I reached across the table and placed my hands firmly over his. "You are not taking anything, Caleb. I am simply restoring what was rightfully yours. You showed incredible courage when you warned me at the church. You chose integrity over blind, toxic loyalty. That is a rare and beautiful thing. This money is your foundation. Use it to build a life you can be proud of." A tear slipped down Caleb's cheek. He stood up from the heavy wooden chair, walked around the table, and hugged me tightly. We stayed like that for a long time, an old woman and a young man finding profound strength in our shared survival. Caleb did not take the money and disappear. Quite the opposite. He used a small portion of the funds to sign a lease on a bright, modest apartment just 10 minutes away from my house. He transferred his credits to a prestigious university right here in the city, ensuring he could come over for dinner multiple times a week. But the most remarkable part of Caleb's recovery was what he decided to do with his pain. He channeled the trauma of his parents' betrayal into his computer science degree. He spent his evenings sitting in my sunroom, his laptop glowing in the dim light, writing thousands of lines of complex code. He developed an innovative software application specifically designed to protect elderly citizens from financial exploitation. The program functioned as a digital shield. It linked directly to public county recorder databases and credit bureaus. If a sudden home equity draw, a suspicious change in title, or a strange notary request appeared on an elderly user's profile, the software instantly generated automated alerts to designated verified emergency contacts. Caleb began partnering with local adult protective services and senior community centers to distribute the software for free. Watching him work, I realized something incredibly powerful about the nature of family legacy. Bradley and Cynthia had been obsessed with money. They viewed wealth as a weapon to assert dominance and a shield to hide their moral failures. But sitting in my quiet home, watching my grandson code a program to save vulnerable people, I understood that true legacy has absolutely nothing to do with bank accounts. My legacy was not the $2.5 million house. My legacy was the integrity, the resilience, and the brilliant compassion sitting right in front of me. Autumn slowly faded into winter, and the cold winds of Chicago returned to rattle the window panes. But inside my house it was warm and brilliantly illuminated. It was a Sunday evening. The air in my kitchen smelled richly of roasted root vegetables, rosemary, and slow-cooked beef. A gentle jazz melody drifted softly from the wireless speaker on the counter. Caleb was standing at the kitchen island laughing as he clumsily attempted to slice a loaf of crusty sourdough bread. I carried a platter of food into the dining room, setting it down on the table. There were no hidden agendas hiding behind polite smiles. There were no secret recorders, no manipulative conversations about estate planning, and no underlying currents of greed. There was just the simple, honest clinking of silverware and the comfortable, easy conversation between two people who trusted each other completely. Caleb sat across from me, talking animatedly about his latest coding project and his upcoming final exams. I listened to his voice, feeling a deep, profound sense of tranquility settle into my bones. The frantic, terrifying scramble of the wedding day felt like it belonged to another lifetime. We had weathered the storm. We had faced the darkest parts of human greed, and we had emerged completely unbroken. The foundation of my life had been aggressively attacked, but it had not collapsed. Instead, the toxic elements had been permanently swept away, leaving behind a structure that was stronger, cleaner, and built on absolute truth. I looked across the table at my grandson, smiled warmly, and finally allowed myself to rest in the pure, undeniable safety of a peaceful home. Exactly 1 year has passed since the crisp October morning when my son stood on the stone steps of the church and barred me from entering. The changing of the seasons always brings a certain kind of reflective clarity, but this autumn feels profoundly different than the last. Today, the sunlight streaming through my kitchen window is not a harsh spotlight illuminating forged documents and financial crimes. It is simply a warm golden glow resting gently on my large oak dining table. Sitting across from me in the bright morning light is my granddaughter, Madison. She is holding a simple yellow pencil, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as she reviews a printed budget spreadsheet. The young woman sitting in my kitchen today is virtually unrecognizable from the frantic, pampered bride who once believed the entire world revolved around her lavish desires. She is no longer wearing designer clothes purchased with stolen escrow funds. She is wearing a comfortable, faded gray sweater and practical denim jeans. Her hair is pulled back into a messy, effortless knot. She works as an administrative coordinator for a local medical clinic, now a job she's secured entirely on her own merit, without relying on her father's toxic network of wealthy influencers. "Look at this line right here," Madison said, tapping the eraser of her pencil against the column labeled discretionary spending. "Mark and I managed to put away an extra $400 this month. If we keep this up, we will have our full emergency fund built by December. And we did not even have to use the credit cards once." I looked at the neat, organized columns of her personal ledger. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming surge of pride expand inside my chest. "That is absolutely brilliant work, Madison," I told her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You are building a real foundation. You are learning how to create security that nobody can ever take away from you." Madison looked up from the paper. Her eyes, which had once been so clouded by the arrogant entitlement of her parents, were now clear-grounded and deeply humble. She offered me a soft, genuine smile. It was incredibly difficult at first, she admitted, her voice dropping to a quiet, reflective tone. "When everything collapsed last year, when Mom and Dad were arrested, and the bank foreclosed on our childhood home, I thought my entire life was over. I was so angry at you. I thought you had destroyed our family out of pure spite." I squeezed her hand a little tighter. "I know you did, sweetheart. That was a very heavy burden for a young newlywed to carry. But I see the truth now. Madison continued, taking a slow, steady breath. I look at where my parents are right now, locked in federal prison, because they could never simply be satisfied with what they had. They always wanted more, and they did not care who they had to crush to get it. If you had not stopped them, if you had just stayed quiet and let them steal your house, Caleb and I would have grown up believing that fraud and manipulation were just normal parts of being successful. You did not destroy our family, Grandma. You burned down a poisonous illusion, so Caleb and I could finally learn how to live in the real world. Hearing those words from her lips was the ultimate validation of every agonizing decision I had made over the past 12 months. The process of holding my own son accountable had been a brutal, soul-crushing journey. It had required me to sever the deepest biological bonds and act with the cold, calculating precision of a battlefield general. But sitting here looking at the resilient, honest young woman my granddaughter had become, I knew with absolute certainty that the sacrifice had been entirely worth the pain. I had not just protected my own financial assets. I had aggressively shattered a generational cycle of toxic narcissistic privilege. By forcing Bradley and Cynthia to face the catastrophic consequences of their greed, I had effectively rescued my grandchildren from inheriting their moral decay. Caleb was currently thriving in his university computer science program, developing his fraud protection software to help vulnerable seniors. Madison and her new husband were learning the profound, quiet dignity of earning an honest paycheck and living within their actual means. They were safe, they were independent, and they were finally free from the crushing weight of their parents' endless lies. Madison packed up her budgeting materials, gave me a long, meaningful hug, and headed out the door to begin her shift at the clinic. After she drove away, I walked slowly through the quiet corridors of my home. I ran my fingertips along the polished wooden banisters and paused to look at the framed artwork hanging on the walls. This house had been targeted for absolute destruction. My own flesh and blood had viewed this sanctuary as nothing more than a convenient pile of bricks to be liquidated for quick cash. They had tried to rip the foundation right out from under my feet, but the house was still standing. It remained a quiet, beautiful fortress. The silence echoing through the rooms was no longer heavy with the threat of hidden cameras or looming foreclosure notices. It was the deep, resonant silence of absolute peace. I had fought a massive, grueling war to keep this home, and I had emerged entirely victorious. But the most valuable asset I retained was not the property itself, nor the millions of dollars safely locked inside my newly established irrevocable trust. The greatest treasure I possessed was the profound tranquility of knowing my conscience was completely clean. I walked down the hallway and stepped into my home office. The morning sun illuminated the heavy mahogany desk where I had spent countless sleepless nights tracking offshore wire transfers and analyzing forged public records. Resting in the corner of the room was a large, heavy cardboard banker's box. It contained every single physical document related to the ordeal. The fraudulent power of attorney, the bank routing, traces the terrifying federal injunctions, and the final court transcripts from the sentencing hearing. I picked up the heavy cardboard lid and placed it firmly over the box, sealing the documents away in the dark. The investigation was officially closed. The criminals were incarcerated. The story was finally over. I walked around the desk, sat down in my heavy leather chair, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked straight ahead, focusing my mind entirely on the journey that had brought me to this exact moment. People often say that a mother's love is supposed to be entirely unconditional. Society demands that a mother must sacrifice her own comfort, her own security, and even her own sanity to protect her children from the harsh realities of the world. We are conditioned to believe that keeping the peace within a family is always more important than demanding basic justice. We are told to quietly absorb the disrespect, to overlook the casual cruelty, and to slowly fade into the background so the next generation can comfortably take what they believe is rightfully theirs. But I am here to tell you that tolerating active malicious evil is not an act of love. Allowing a predator to thrive simply because you share the same genetic material is not forgiveness. It is cowardly complicity. My son Bradley believed that because I was a 68-year-old widow, I had lost my fundamental right to basic human dignity. He believed that my lifetime of hard work, my financial security, and my very home were simply resources for him to exploit. He looked at the woman who gave him life and saw nothing but a convenient disposable asset. He assumed my maternal instincts would make me weak, compliant, and desperate for his minimal affection. When he stood on the stone steps of the church in his expensive tailored tuxedo, he thought he was demonstrating his supreme power. When he put his hand on my chest and told me I was not on the guest list, he genuinely believed he was punishing me for being an inconvenience. He thought he was locking me out of a celebration. He had absolutely no idea that in that very moment he was locking the heavy iron doors of his own federal prison cell. He thought he was erasing me from a party, but he was actually erasing himself from the rest of my life. There is a very specific, dangerous kind of arrogance that infects people who believe they are entitled to everything you have built. They rely on your silence. They bank on your embarrassment. They construct their entire fraudulent empires on the assumption that you will be too terrified of public scandal to ever fight back. But the moment you refuse to be a silent victim, the moment you drag their dark, hidden crimes out into the blinding light of objective truth, their entire illusion crumbles into dust. I chose to fight. I chose to use every single weapon in my professional arsenal to dismantle my son's criminal enterprise. It was the hardest, most agonizing decision I have ever had to make in my entire life. But looking at my grandchildren now, seeing them build honest, beautiful lives, free from the shadow of that toxic manipulation, I would make the exact same choice 1,000 times over. So now I leave you with a question to consider. Think about your own life, your own family, and the boundaries you have drawn around your own dignity. If you ever found yourself standing on those church steps, looking into the cold, calculating eyes of a child who was actively plotting to steal your life's work and throw you out into the street, what would you do? Would you bow your head, turn away in silent tears, and sacrifice your own survival just to keep a fragile, toxic peace? Or would you unleash the full devastating force of the truth and use their own breathtaking cruelty as the final nail in their coffin? Please share your thoughts and tell me your answers in the comments below.